Hello, this is Derek Taylor, your professor for American History 1, and I made this video for you because I wanted to, now that I've graded all the papers, just go over the article critique assignment that I gave you a couple weeks ago, just to sort of go over this in depth, because when I gave this to you, I dumped this in your lap to give you an idea of what real historians do. And I didn't expect, by the way, most of you do too well in trying to understand the arguments being presented in this essay. And actually, some of you did better than I would have thought. So don't feel bad if I critiqued you on the assignment. I try to give some feedback to most people, but this is a fuller explanation of what was going on in the essay, because quite frankly, there was no way you were going to get all the details right. That's part of the reason I did this, to give you. I wanted to give you something that was hard, so that you know how hard this actually is, partly. But you do need to sort of. It's a good habit to get up to be able to pick out the main point people actually have in an essay. And in this essay, as you'll see, and sometimes things you need to remember about academic writing. Sometimes the authors don't spell out in a single sentence what their thesis is. You have to sort of gather it from what they're saying. There actually is, I think, one sentence in here that is the thesis in the essay. I don't get to that, but I want to go through this because some of you, again, just some of the things that I saw when I was grading this stuff. So this is by Gordon Wood, and I think I've mentioned this earlier. Gordon Wood is one of the, I think he's retired now, but he has been for most of his career one of the preeminent historians of the American Revolution and the early American Republic. And in this essay, what he's doing is he's recounting a debate among historians. So one of the things, again, some of you guys got confused about, like, for example, some of you thought he was saying, well, he's against capitalism. He never says anything about it himself. And I'll show you. Take the first, you can see here the essay, the first article. Of all the isms that afflict us, capitalism is the worst. Now, I think some of you read that sentence and said, oh, he means we, and that must mean he's agreeing. Remember, the audience he's talking to and saying we is other historians. And what he's referring to, the next sentence, according to many scholars, a lot of his colleagues don't like it. He never comes out and says where he thinks it's a bad or a good thing. I can actually tell you he thinks it's a pretty good thing. But he doesn't talk, that's not his focus in here, so it doesn't come into play. I think some of you attributed prejudice or something to him that's not in the essay. So you got to pay attention. And he goes through that first paragraph. I'll read it. According to many scholars, capitalism has been ultimately responsible for much of what ails us, both in the past and present, including our race problem, our grossly unequal distribution of natural wealth, yada, 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 and the general sense of malaise and oppression that academics in particular feel. And that's where it goes on to talk about the debate on the origins of this powerful force. Next paragraph, he goes through and says the trouble is we scholars cannot agree on the nature of the beast. And he goes through the various different definitions that have begun of what capitalism is. And this is where you get into this debate he's talking about here, because it turns on definitions. What is capitalism? It's a theoretical model invented by Karl Marx and other people, early part of the 19th century. And so, and he goes on here. He's laying out a debate. And he goes and he talks about the two competing narratives, two competing interpretations of early American history. And this is the third paragraph. The confusion has gotten so great that we now have competing contradictory studies that show that the first 2 centuries of early American history were either capitalist from the beginning or never capitalist at all. And he goes through and he starts listing, he's citing examples, Stephen Innes, about the 17th century Puritans, Michael Merrill, about the early 19th century market economy, those sorts of things. And he goes on further. The next one, actually, these two seemingly polar positions represent the extremes of a debate historians have been having over the nature of early New England's society and economy, because that's New England's where, by definition, our advanced economy began. He goes on to say, he lays out the first thesis in this debate is that America had always been capitalist. He calls these historians liberal or market historians. America has always been capitalistic. And he describes this other group as a revisionist group. So that paragraph on the bottom of page 294, last paragraph, a quarter century ago or so ago, a group of historians, generally labeled social or moral economy historians, began challenging this view of early America as a modern, market-oriented, capitalistic world. The colonial farmers, particularly the New England farmers, it seems, did not possess a capitalistic mentality after all. They were not primarily interested in working for profit, a lack of interest in the bottom line, et cetera, et cetera. Yada, yada, yada. These historians don't like capitalism. They're trying to argue that early America wasn't that capitalistic. Again, the debate, depending on the definition you have of capitalism, and he talks about this somewhere in here. He talks about historians um, sort of caricaturing capitalism as being made up of, greedy, individualistic people who want to maximize their profits. That's something he talks about over and over again in here. He'll go on to talk about this transition to capitalism debate, and he's talking about some of the writers in this moral economy school of historians. And he actually says they actually have a pretty good idea when it came about. He says at the bottom of the second paragraph on 295, she has one historian, Winifred Rothenberg. She has been able to date the emergence of the market economy in New England countryside, placing it in the last 2 decades of the 18th century following the American Revolution. And for the most part, he goes through this. He's going through this debate in detail. And this is probably where you guys get lost. The stuff he's relaying here, again, you don't have the background to understand this stuff. And I know, again, why'd you give it to us? If first of all, you need a knowledge background if you can understand history in any real serious way, and you don't have it. That's why you're taking our course is an introduction, so you'll have some basic background. But here he's going through again the people who've been trying to challenge the thesis that America was always capitalistic, going through. He mentions Rothenberg. He goes down here and starts talking about some people who are influenced by Marxism, Alan Kulikov, James Henretta. These are all moral economy. They're not all Marxist influence historians. And it's important, of course, because the debate turns on those definitions. That's why he's talking about, and he's, citing historians who are saying, well, this is Kulikov, the bottom of 290, first paragraph on 296. He say this is Wood relaying Kulikov's opinion here. In fact, Kulikov admits as much when he says that the two sides contend over the degree of local self-sufficiency and the extent of market exchange rather than the fact of exchange. In other words, they all agree there's market exchanges going on, just how much and the degree of it. And what he seems to be going here is, again, he goes on the next paragraph, he's talking about what he thinks the mistakes of the moral economy historians are, which they're committed to a distinction that comes from Karl Marx between producing for use and producing for exchange, which he says is very dubious. And when he says this is when he's critiquing them. He says when they go back to the actual behavior of New England farmers, they have to use this why these New England farmers weren't capitalists. They have to keep dredging up this distinction, which doesn't seem to work. And next paragraph, he extends that criticism. He says these moral economy historians seem to have an overdrawn and caricatured image of an entrepreneur or capitalist as someone who thinks about nothing but the bottom line and has an all-consuming drive for profits that rise roughshod over the needs of his family or his relationship with the community. And this is the key phrase, that this is what it takes. Then very few farmers in history have ever been this kind of selfish, profit-maximizing individualist. And he goes next paragraph to explain why he doesn't agree with this. It is these historians' deep aversion to capitalism that lies behind these caricatured image of capitalists. And in this paragraph, he'll go on and talk about some of these sorts of things. Who's writing? And again, he goes into historians who were influenced by Marxism. Kulikov and the major one here. Next one, Michael Merrill, again, trying to fit this into, Marxist theory. Then he goes on, this is 298 here. Again, he says, hey, it'd be better if we could just get rid of the word capitalism altogether, but it's no longer possible. That language is too much part of our culture, too much part of history to sort of ignore. So he's talking about here the ways in which Merrill tries to use different terms to equate to something like a Marxist theory. And this is what he's talking about when he wants to say that the American Michael Merrill is saying the American Revolution was a profoundly anti-capitalist enterprise. It just got hijacked by what he calls the moneyed classes. Again, when you go through this, this is again hard to keep this straight in your head because he's relaying several different people's arguments, and some of you, again, I know that's hard. He does have an argument. I'll get to this in a moment, but he's relaying Merrill's argument and critiquing here. He doesn't. He goes on here, by the way, to talk about the language that he's using. He criticizes that use of that term "moneyed classes." Again, referring to Merrill's argument here, Wood says, against these democratic anti-capitalists, he places the capitalists, or the moneyed classes, composed of merchants, financiers, or budding master manufacturers. The problem arises with this last group, the quote-unquote budding master manufacturers. We today might readily agree that these master manufacturers, soon to be labeled businessmen, are capitalists or future capitalists. But in the 18th century, should they be separated from the rest of the artisans? Contemporaries in the early republic, including the master manufacturers themselves, did not think so. They still thought of these master manufacturers, however wealthy, as men who worked for a living with their hands, and thus they grouped them with the other laborers in society. Now, I'm stopping there because, okay, what is he doing there? Okay, this is something virtually nobody understood. One of the things he's doing, remember, this is a debate about definitions, right? What is capitalism? And what he's saying there is that, okay, we're using these Marxist terms, which come from the 1830s, 1840s, and projecting them back on the Republic. Look at what he says. Contemporaries in the early Republic didn't think of themselves as being capitalists. And the reason why, and this is the key, this is his actual argument, by the way, is that they still thought of these master manufacturers as men who work with their hands. And thus they group them with other laborers in society. All manufacturers, all people who own factories were laborers, even if they were filthy rich. That's his argument. In other words, he's bringing in a definition that contemporaries in the 1780s would have, after the revolution, would have recognized. If you have a problem defining things, go back to the sources and look what people at the time actually said and try to find an analog. This is what he's doing. And this is what he goes on the next paragraph to emphasize. The issue for society of the early republic was not who was a capitalist, but who was a laborer. As John Adams put it in 1790, the great question will forever remain, who shall work? And here's the key, here's his key where he's getting into his argument. Gentlemen presumably did not work, but everyone else did, especially artisans. The status of artisans or mechanics because it was changing rapidly, is a problem for us. We seem to agree, and I'm reading from here, we seem to agree that artisans represent a variety of people in ranks, ranging from very wealthy to poor, with most being thought to occupy the middling ranks in society. In the 18th century, each artisans were usually organized vertically by craft. That is, each craft, whether silversmiths, shoemakers, coopers, or whatever, was organized into 3 gradations: masters, journeymen, and apprentices. In the 18th century, these vertical gradations within each craft tended to identify each with each other and their particular craft, rather than horizontally with the masters, journeymen, or apprentices in the craft. What he means to say is they identified each other with the laboring class in their craft, right? They didn't see themselves as a class across different crafts. The term class is a Marxist term. It is a 19th century term. They didn't speak in those terms in the 18th century. He doesn't come out and tell you this, by the way, because his audience doesn't need to be told that. They know that. Next paragraph. In the 18th century, most aristocrats or gentlemen who did not have to work with their hands still lumped together into the ignoble and mean category of laborers all these varieties of craftsmen and gradations of artisans and mechanics, mingling together in their minds wealthy masters with the lowest and poorest of workers. Despite a growing appreciation of the value of labor and heightened egalitarian sentiments, many 18th century gentry, and that's a key term, we'll come back to this, in other words, still clung to the 2,000-year-old prejudice against manual labor, a prejudice that made it very difficult for artisans or mechanics, however rich and respectable, to claim genteel status as long as they continue to work for a living with their hands, or even to run a business that involved employees working with their hands. This is why Benjamin Franklin, made so much of his retirement from his printing business at the age of 42. Only then could he become a full-fledged gentleman and devote himself to science and public service. And the rest of the article, from this point on, basically he starts giving examples, his evidence for his argument. What his argument he's shaping up to make here is that he's saying, well, if we're going to define what capitalism is in the early republic, we can't use our own terms. We have to go back to how people thought of it just after the revolution. And what he's saying is he's making another distinction, not between working class, middle class, upper class, those are all later terms, but between the laboring class, and I'm going to put this term, I think he used the term several times, but the gentry class. And he's talking about, when he says 2,000-year-old prejudice against manual labor, he's talking about in older aristocratic societies, it was, manual labor was thought to be, you were thought to be a servile person. Again, it's hard for you to imagine that you lived in a capitalist society your whole life. Work is everything. It's bad if you don't work. It's the opposite. And if you're wondering why this is the case, the reason why is that if you worked, that means you were a serf or a slave who worked for somebody who had land. And so that's why there was an odor of like you're from the lower orders, basically. It's a very different type of society prior to the Industrial Revolution. Think of it as a society of orders rather than a society of classes. A society of orders is defined by birth and occupation rather than sort of economic accumulation. Which, even though the United States never had an aristocracy, it did have, and he doesn't explain any of this in the essay, did have, it had wealthy planters in Virginia who fancied themselves to be British gentlemen. It had, there were old families going back to the founding of the colonies in New York and places like this. That, for example, Alexander Hamilton, who was definitely not of that class, married into, who thought of themselves as being gentlemen, who looked down on manual labor, who would not be what we'd call in modern terms capitalists. Go down. We'll skip ahead here because I want to go through every single paragraph in this. This is page 302, and he starts talking about William Manning. And this is something too, again, some of you said he didn't give any evidence for his argument. He gives lots of evidence, actually. In fact, he says, this is the middle of 302, perhaps we can clarify our understanding of what was happening by focusing on William Manning, the self-educated common New England farmer whose writings Michael Merrill and Sean Wiolence have recently edited. And again, I know all those names kind of ran together. Michael Merrill and Sean Wiolence are people who are influenced by Marxism, who say there was no capitalism in the early republic. In other words, he's going to take a look at writings, in other words, evidence from the period edited by the people he's critiquing. This is how history works. You find the sort of same evidence everybody's looking at, and you try to give your own interpretation of it. And this is where he goes into William Manning's life, his career. And some of you, by the way, got this distinction. Some of you had, when you identified his thesis, that, it was laboring people or laborers who made capitalism the republic. And that's partly true. And this is where you get him talking about Manning. Just go to that paragraph on the bottom of 302. Manning's writer, however, were not unusual. Attacks on the leisured aristocratic few and defenses of labor by mechanics, farmers, and laborers like Manning became increasingly common in post-revolutionary America. Indeed, the American celebration of work in these years was far more successful in conquering the culture, at least in the northern states, than comparable efforts in Europe. By the early decades of the 19th century, there were very few gentry left in the northern states of America who could openly admit that they did not work for a living. In other words, who could openly admit any longer that they were fundamentally different from the likes of William Manning, Walter Brewster, or Christopher Levingwell, people he's already mentioned. Again, what he's saying is the laboring classes essentially took over the country. The gentry was never very numerous in the colonies by the time you get to the early 1800s. And again, this is crucial. Next paragraph on 303. Manning, writing in the 1790s, of course, had no idea that he was participating in the cause of capitalism. All he could see was a great social struggle in which, quote, the whole contention lies between those who labor for a living and those who do not. In Manning's opinion, those who did not have to work were mainly big merchants, professionals, executive and judicial officers of government, quote, and all the rich who could live on their incomes without putting labor, unquote. They were the kinds of men who had a sense of superiority, who generally associate together and look down with too much contempt on those that labor. Although Manning at times includes stock jobbers and speculators within his category of leisured, he was scarcely thinking of those who did not labor for a living as capitalists. Rather, his leisured few, numbering about 1/8 of the population, were those traditionally referred to as aristocrats or gentlemen. Most gentlemen did not work for a living in any traditional meaning of the term, or if they did, they worked solely with their heads. Instead, as Manning, if not his editors, he's criticizing, Merrill and Willents realized the incomes of such leisure gentlemen, quote, lie chiefly in money and interest, rent, salaries, and fees that are fixed on the nominal value of money, etc., etc. Here's another key part, right? We can't identify capitalists with people who were like that in the 18th century, with big bankers, with the rich industrialists, because they weren't seen as being superior. It was the people who didn't work who were seen as being superior. He goes on the next paragraph to explain why. Although we might want anachronistically, and if you don't know what anachronism means, it means projecting something back into the past, a later period that shouldn't be there, to designate as capitalists some of Manning's leisured few, those Federalist leaders, and most of these people, by the way, are Federalists in the early Republic. They were essentially whom Manning meant by his few who did not labor for a living, were not really the persons most responsible for the emergence of the dynamic capitalist economy of the early Republic. We make a big mistake thinking that capitalism was created mainly by Alexander Hamilton and a few stock jobbers, speculators, and wealthy merchants. If any group was most responsible for the burgeoning capitalist economy of the early Republic, it was the Republicans and all the commercially minded artisans and farmers who were striving to get ahead. Laboring men like Walter Brewster, such as the people he's already mentioned. Now, going down here, he goes into he's again going through this and going through Manning's life and talking about this and why he's not a capitalist in the way that these Marxist influenced historians think he is. He's not a profit maximizing individualist, all this stuff. That he's, again, he's talking about why those definitions don't work, because they're a caricature, because they're this, they're that. And he identifies, because what Merrill and Willents are saying, this is down the bottom of 305, the first paragraph. Nor do all of Manning's commercial, one could participate in all these commercial endeavors, this is Merrill and Willents, their argument, and still oppose capitalism, that is a commercial economy dominated by moneyed men. And it comes back again to that phrase, he's latching onto it because it does a lot of work on their argument. And this is again, the difficulty seems to be with these quote-unquote moneyed men. They seem to inject a capitalist poison into an otherwise healthy commercial market economy. Who might they be? Merrill and Willents apparently think Manning's few rich men who did not work for a living were the moneyed men. They presumably supplied the capital for capitalist expansion. But these Federalist gentry, even if some of them invested in businesses, represented much more the old aristocratic order than they did the capitalist future. By themselves, they were never numerous or wealthy enough to finance the rise of capitalism. He goes on to talk about this is the reason why there wasn't a lot of capital in the Republic. That's why they created a lot of state banks. And in fact, it is anti-federalists, people like William Manning, the laborers, who wanted more banks to be started so they could have more capital to start businesses. It goes on to talk about the issue of paper money, which is a big issue in the early Republic. Main thing is, by this point, he's kind of already made his argument. And this basically, if you want to get down to the bottom here in one sentence, this is the bottom of 306. Although Manning was not, quote, a profit-maximizing individualist who believed in the universal justice of commercial markets, unquote, nevertheless, this is his thing, this is these last two, nevertheless, he and his hardworking Republican laborers were the main force behind America's capitalist market evolution. I would say that sentence starting with nevertheless, and then the next one. Actually, the next one's even more important. For good or for ill, American capitalism was created by American democracy. And the reason why I would pick that sentence, for good or ill, American capitalism was created by American democracy, is that, and again, he doesn't spell this out because his interlocutors recognize this. He's been dealing with historians who deal almost wholly in economic terms. That is to say, capitalism is a form of exchange. It just does this. What he's saying basically is that capitalism emerges out of the revolution itself, because the revolution makes those laborers dominant in society. They overcome their gentry foes. They overcome the Federalists. They overcome, at least in the North, and later on even in the South, they'll have influence. Um, they overcome that ancient prejudice of work being servile, and that social change is what makes capitalism work. In other words, his answer is to change the terms of the debate to those people recognized in the 18th century. And again, I know that's really complicated. Everything I just described is really complicated. That's why, by the way, some of you did notice the last couple of pages, he's talking about the emergence of civil society. This is a big thing in American history. What he means by civil society is all those voluntary associations that were created in the early republic. If you should have read Joyce Appleby, the excerpt from her book. She talks about this. The political associations, book clubs, and this yada yada this, and political parties, but also religious voluntary organizations. They come to form the new political class in the new republic. And what he's saying basically is this sort of thing: the transformation of society itself produces capitalism, not capitalism producing something else. And that's why he mentions it. But it's part and parcel that what he's saying is the political revolution created capitalism because it altered the balance between, the gentry had always been people. It was so ingrained, that prejudice against work, that they were the ones who were running society. What happens in America first, before it happens anywhere else, is that shifts, where being seen to work is actually a good thing. And that's why, again, some of you kind of got close to that. You kind of got that. I know that's complicated. Again, I wasn't trying to make you feel dumb or anything. But yeah, if I were to pick out the main phrase there, it's for good or ill, American capitalism was created by American democracy. To me, that's his thesis. And again, you're not in a position to judge his thesis, by the way, whether it's good or not, right or not. But that's effectively what he's saying, is that the political revolution caused capitalism for a variety of different reasons. And so, again, I know that was hard. I apologize if you guys, by the way, when I took off points on some of your essay, your responses, your critiques, it's mostly because some of you didn't really very specific in trying to identify a thesis. I know that's hard, but you're gonna have to do that in certain assignments in your college career, where sometimes, for reasons here, Gordon Wood is not dumb at all. He can assume a lot of things he doesn't have to explain, because he explained it to people who know this stuff already. They have the background. You don't even have the background here. I know it was hard. I just wanted you to get what it's like to actually argue at a high level about historical things. And that was the only, most of you did okay. Most of you did fine. Again, some of you got the basics, at least the rudimentary form of his thesis there. But that's the long and short of it there, is that the political revolution itself caused capitalism, because it got rid of that distinction between working and not working. So, all right. And so, again, that's why you had to pay close attention when you read things like this. Again, I just went through all that stuff because it's all sort of important to his argument. And again, as you go through college, you'll have to do more of this. You'll get better at it. But paying attention to, it's hard. It's hard to follow an argument like that. Most people couldn't do it very well anyway. So, maybe you're not cut out for it. But I just want to get, again, in simplified form, you get this type of thing going on in newspapers and journals and stuff like this. This is the highest level type of argumentation you can get in regards of history. So, but I hope it wasn't too hard. I hope you did at least get something out of it. And that's all I at least wanted to explain it a little more fully, what the article was going for, make sure you guys understood that. If that wasn't clear, you can email me about it and complain about me. Maybe I wasn't clear on that, but that's all I wanted to say and do. So I hope you guys had a good weekend, a good Easter if you celebrated Passover, and I hope you guys have a good week. Hearing from me soon in the discussion forum. Take care.